great hurricane that struck Galveston, Texas in 1900 remains the single worst natural disaster in U.S. history. Between 6,000 and 8,000 people were killed and 3,600 buildings were destroyed. In Galveston's Summer of the Storm, author Julie Lake plunges a young girl and the reader into the midst of that storm. When 14-year-old Abby Kate boards the train in Austin to spend 3 weeks with her grandmother in Galveston, she's full of excitement. But a 3-week visit stretches into a summer when Abby Kate's brother in Austin develops diphtheria. She cannot go home. She is still in Galveston on September 8th when the massive hurricane strikes the city. At first, the prospect of a storm is exciting, but when Abby Kate takes an ill-advised trip to watch the waves crash on the beach, the storm turns into a terrifying monster. Unable to make it back to grandmother Lyndon's house, Abby Kate, her older cousin Ellen, and Ellen's friend Eon take refuge in a private home. When the house falls apart, Abby Kate is on her own, clinging to a plank in swirling waters with the wind howling around her head. Julie Lake's story was inspired by the actual accounts shared by men, women, and children who lived through the Galveston storm of 1900. One of these survivors was 18-year-old Sarah Helen Littlejohn, who rode out the storm in the upstairs bedroom of her parents' home. Sarah Helen's handwritten essay about the storm is on display at the Galveston County Historical Museum, along with many photographs of the island before and after the hurricane. Our author, Julie Lake, lives in Austin, Texas. This is her first novel. Julie Lake, thank you for joining us this evening.
It's great to be here.
Well, first of all, how did you decide to do a story on the 1900 Galveston hurricane?
Well, I had heard about that hurricane for a very long time. I didn't know very much about it, but I just remembered hearing from really when I was a little girl that there had once been this terrible hurricane on the Texas coast that had hit Galveston. And I also remembered hearing that there had been a town called Indianola on the Texas coast and that hurricanes had destroyed that city entirely and that it was completely gone. So I think there was always this romance associated with the Texas coast and hurricanes that had hit it a long time ago. So I just always remember that, and then when I was working for an insurance association, I saw the statistics again, and then I ran across some photographs of the storm. And once I saw those pictures, I really couldn't get the idea out of my mind. I just kept thinking about the damage and what it must have been like to have been in that storm.
Had you given much thought about hurricanes before writing the book?
I'd always been aware of them. I live in Austin, Texas, so I'm quite a bit of ways in from the coast. So hurricanes had never really felt like a big danger to me, though after some hurricanes, you'll have tornadoes that spin off and cause damage. And there have been some times when that's happened up in central Texas. But I was taking a vacation in South Carolina a number of years ago, and it was the week before Hurricane Hugo hit, and that was the first time I'd been to that state, and we had this wonderful trip, and then right when we got home, the hurricane hit, and so it really struck me how fast a hurricane can come upon a coastal area, and how you don't have a whole lot of warning, and one week the weather is gorgeous, and the next you can have this terrible disaster.
Right, well, the good thing is today, in today's day and age, we get ample warnings, unlike the 1900 hurricane. But my next question is, the book has a lot of dramatic moments. When writing this book, did you feel that it would be educational for children in regards to what hurricanes can do, or was it more for a storytelling type of a reading?
Well, I was really trying to combine both those in my story. I feel like children will read anything if it's a good story. So I felt like whatever I put together, it had to have a real strong plot. It had to have a lot of drama. And I felt like it needed to be characters that a child could identify with and be interested in. So that was my primary goal. But I also wanted to have it be something that teachers might want to use in school, or that children, particularly here in Texas, when they're learning about Texas history, that this would bring this period of time alive to them. Because most of the children that I talked to here in Texas didn't know much about this storm. And I felt like this was such a dramatic point in Texas history that it was something they should know about. And especially with the death toll as high as it was, between 6,000 to 8,000 people, really that was more than the Titanic and the Great Chicago Fire and the big San Francisco earthquake and fire. And even if you roll in the September 11th deaths, if you add all those deaths together, this hurricane from 1900 killed more people than all those disasters together. And I just felt like it was such a tragic event in the course of the history of Galveston that I really felt like it was something children would be interested in. There was also the whole idea of how this city rebuilt itself. It did not disappear into the earth like Indianola did. These people pulled themselves up in the midst of all this wreckage, and they rebuilt their city.
That's
and I found that story of courage very inspiring.
Now, your primary character is Abby Kate, a 14-year-old girl caught in the hurricane. It was a fictional character, by the way.
Yes, it was.
Was this character based on Sarah Helen Littleton, who is the 18-year-old who actually survived the hurricane? Her writings and pictures are in the museum in Galveston. Was any of this based on her story?
I had already put together my character before I ran across the information on Sarah Helen. I was well into the course of the writing of the book, but it was very validating to read Sarah Helen's account of the hurricane, because I had worried, had I made my character too old, could a child my character's age survive the storm and come through with optimism and tact? I just didn't know how realistic it was to have been a child in that hurricane. The damage was so terrible after the hurricane. You can imagine the bodies piled up, all the outhouses overturned on the island, the smell. Just these people for many, many days were trapped on the island, and I didn't know how that would affect a child. And then when I ran across Sarah Helen's account that she had written a very short time after the storm, she just showed such strength, and it has a very wistful quality to it. It's very sad because her father intends to stay on the island, and she's afraid. With Abby Kate, where she actually gets carried out to sea during the midst of the hurricane, clinging to wreckage, there were a number of people that happened to. I read survivor accounts in the Rosenberg Library in Galveston, and they described those types of experiences. So I really based Abby Kate's experience in the storm once the house breaks up on those accounts. But there was one account of this woman who was carried off to sea, and then she woke on the beach and there was a dog beside her, and she was shivering with cold from being in the water so long, and she curled up to that dog, and that memory, it stuck in my head. And then when I had my character reach the beach again, I thought it would be nice to borrow that anecdote and use that with my character, and how comforting that would be for a child to wake up and find this big furry dog, sleeping beside her.
Now, there were originally going to be two sisters in this book, and I understand you had to do quite a bit of editing. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, Jim. When I started the book, my first version of it, I had written two sisters into the book. My Abby Kate character, which is the main character now, she was the younger sister. She was 10 years old, and she had an older sister named Lizzie who was 15. And I had two characters because I wanted to show many different hurricane experiences. So in my first version of the book, Abby Kate is with her grandmother during the storm, and the bottom floor of the grandmother's house floods, and then they move up to the second floor. And then and then she's there when things were banging against the house, and one of the neighbors, they rescued them through the window. So it was a very dramatic scene, but it was much more safe than what happened to the older sister, which she gets carried out to sea with the cousin, and then she drifts back and survives. But then the publisher wanted me to consolidate those experiences into one character, and they wanted the main character to be a couple of years older, so she would have the stamina to survive the hurricane clinging to wreckage. So I had to eliminate the older sister, and then I made my Abby Kate character be 14 instead of 10.
Wow. Now, that was about halfway through the book?
I I had written the whole manuscript at that point, so I basically had to go through every single chapter of the book and take out the older sister and alter my main character to be the single character. So there were some things that I liked about the older sister character that I had to cut out, and I would shift those qualities or traits to other characters in the book or to Abby Kate, and then some things I just had to take out entirely. From the first scene to the very last scene, from the first scene where Abby Kate is traveling on the train, she originally was with her sister, and then I had to make it logical that she could be traveling alone. So I had to shift a lot of events around to make things make sense. Yeah.
A lot of work. Now, there's a lot of similarities in this hurricane to what happened on 9/11. And the reason I say that is the dates are similar, and the amount of people potentially that could have been killed were very similar.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I was struck by the similarities because when I was doing the rewrite and taking out the older sister, that was just, I started that project about a week before 9/11. And I found myself reluctant to go back into the book at that point because it really is so sad what happens in the hurricane and so tragic, and to put myself in that frame of mind was real difficult. I had done it once and I wasn't sure I wanted to do that again, but that's what I had to do to rewrite the book. I had to put myself back into my characters' places and imagine what all those different events would be like to be a child experiencing them. And then right when I was just starting that process was when the 9/11 tragedy occurred. And it was really hard because at that point we wanted to get away from the bad stuff. What was happening on TV was so awful. But in a very strange way, I found that it helped me during the rewrite because what was happening in New York and in Washington was so similar to what was happening to my characters, particularly the World Trade Center crashes. I found myself thinking about the similarities, that Galveston was an island and Manhattan was an island, and in both those disasters, nobody knew what was going to happen. It just happened so suddenly. They were not at all prepared for it. There was no way to really escape what was happening, and even the response of the Red Cross afterwards, and in the Galveston Hurricane in 1900, the Red Cross played a very strong role in the recovery of Galveston. Clara Barton was 79 years old in 1900, and the Galveston Hurricane was her very last mission that she did.
You know, it really puts that hurricane in perspective of how bad this really was when you can compare it to 9/11.
Yeah.
Especially the amount of people that were killed. It's just unbelievable. You know, what stands out in my mind in your book is when you describe them standing on the shoreline and watching the waves as the hurricane is coming in and not realizing how bad it's going to be in a short period of time.
Yeah, I had read survivor accounts, and really with any storm, the people in Galveston would go down to watch the waves because they could be very spectacular. And it really was a recreational event when a storm would come. But Galveston had never had a storm like that. The people on the island, the old-timers, they felt like they knew how bad a hurricane could get. But the hurricanes they'd had before, they'd had a big hurricane in 1875 and another in 1886. But those hurricanes did not hit Galveston, precisely. They veered off. And the wind speeds never exceeded 60 miles per hour, and the storm surge only got to be about 8 feet on those storms. So they were using those as their reference point to how bad any hurricane could be. Now, the 1900 storm was a Category 4. The storm surge got up to 15 feet in parts of town, so it literally swallowed the whole island, and the wind speeds were estimated at 120 miles an hour. They had never seen anything like that.
Right. Yep, big difference between 60 and 120. It's not just double the wind, from what I understand. It's sometimes 3 or 4 times the force.
And there were a lot of other reasons why they did not expect a storm of this intensity. They had always seen what they called a brick red sky before a bad storm, and the sky was not like that on this morning. And And then also this storm, the 1900 storm, it hit just to the left of Galveston, which meant they experienced what you call the dirty edge of the storm. And the storm surges are always the worst on the right side of a hurricane.
Right.
And that right side was precisely what passed over Galveston.
Yep. They had the wind constantly driving in from the east, which pushed up the storm surge. And, of course, they didn't have the wall, which we'll get to in a little bit. But
now, and another thing, there was a storm blowing from the north against the hurricane, and that kept the water level lower than it should have been for quite a while. And, again, that was confusing for the people on the island because the wind was blowing pretty hard, but the water was not as high as they were used to.
Well, you really did your homework on this storm. I'm learning a lot here tonight.
It's a fascinating storm and a very interesting time period.
Oh, yeah.
With the differences between our day and back then.
Right. Well, I think the most dramatic part of this book was when Abby Kate was at the Douglases' home. When at the height of the hurricane, they were running towards the house. They went inside the home, and when the water rose to the second floor, the house tipped over, and they were all gasping for air. Was that all your idea, the wording and everything, or did you just dream all that up? Or I mean, that's really amazing writing.
Well, I had read some survivor accounts, and there's one survivor account from the Sealy Hospital in Galveston, which experienced quite a bit of flooding during the storm. And they do not know who wrote it, but this woman is writing this letter to her husband. It's the only account they have, which was actually written during the storm itself. And she described the hospital, the area she was in, as being a sort of dark, sinking ship. And when I read that account, the image of that in my mind, what it would be like to have this house, which has always been a safe place for you and dry, a shelter from the storm, to all of a sudden have it turn into a ship that's sinking in the water. It was such a vivid image that I called upon that when I was describing that section, when I was writing that passage. And I just tried to use my imagination as far as what a child would feel like.
Well, I just thought that was the most dramatic part of the book, and it really captured me. And this is where I think people are really going to enjoy this book when they read it, because though I've read a lot of hurricane books, and back to the early question I asked you about the two sisters being narrowed down to one for the book, it really helps you to keep your attention because you're so focused on this little girl's adventures through this hurricane that it really is dramatic, especially in that paragraph where the house is tipping over. It's just really something.
Oh, I know. And it's funny when you write a book, a novel, a work of fiction, your characters are invented, but as you write it, they really become alive for you, and they really start talking to you. And some of the things my characters would say in the book would be things when I was laying in bed at night, unable to sleep. I would hear their voices in my head, and I would think, I need to write that down, because that's exactly what Freddie would say, or exactly what Abby Kate would say. And when I was writing that section in the book, I felt so bad for my Abby Kate character, because I thought this is a horrible thing for her to have to experience.
Yeah.
And even though I knew she was going to be okay and that she was going to survive, I just really, I really felt for her, because by that point she really had come alive in my mind.
I thought that was so sad about Freddie, the little boy in the beginning of the book, or actually throughout the story, who is always giving Abby Kate a hard time. And I don't want to get into the exact details of the relationship between the two, but he's always a tyrant towards her.
Yeah.
And when he lost his father in the hurricane, it completely changed his personality to this calm, quiet boy towards the end of the book. And it took Abby Kate herself to get him off of the train when they moved out of Galveston. His family had to move, of course, without his father. And she's the one that got him off that train and could talk him off that train after all that they had been through. I just thought that was a great ending. Was his story also fictional?
Well, his story is fictional in that character, but I took some of that from real life with some of my experiences. When I was 11, my father died very suddenly of a heart attack, and so I had experienced firsthand the shock of losing a parent so suddenly. And so I tried to draw upon some of my feelings afterwards, and whenever appropriate for that character, what he would be feeling, and again, the sense that his whole life was changing. Not only had he experienced this terrible hurricane, But his life as he knew it was changing. His father was gone. His mother was trying to take over the family. In his case, they actually moved. That did not happen to me when my father died. But I just remembered how I had the sense after my father's death that my life had changed. It would never be the same again. And so I tried to make that come alive in that character.
Well, you sure tempered him in this story, because he was pretty wild in the beginning, and he really calmed down in the end.
Now, if I ever write a sequel to this, he'll pep up a little bit again.
Yeah, that was really quite a change in personality there.
Yeah.
Now, who is Teresa? You mentioned that in the beginning of the book, a survivor of the storm.
That description is really symbolic. Her name's pronounced Teresa.
Teresa.
She was a girl that I went to grade school and high school with, and the storm that she experienced was more of a personal, emotional type of a storm. She had a very, very difficult childhood and abusive family, and then when she was a teenager, she got cancer not once but twice. And she just had a very, very hard life, very difficult things happening to her, but she survived all that, and she turned out into a beautiful person and was just inspiring to everybody around her. I really used Teresa's life as an example of how you can suffer through things, but yet you can come out stronger. And that's why I dedicated the story to her, because in my mind, she really did survive a storm, and she
has to be
came
proud.
out stronger for it and touched many lives.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, I understand you had some help from students in this book.
Yes.
What kind of help did they give you?
Well, I had a lot of different kinds of help. It was real funny. When I started to write the book, I knew I was going to write it for children, but I had never written a book like this before, and I didn't know how bad to make the hurricane, the description of the hurricane. As you can, if you use your imagination, the thought of 6,000 to 8,000 people being dead on an island in Texas in the middle of the summer, isolated for days and days after the storm, you can imagine that it really turned into a sort of hell. I didn't know how much to bring out the descriptions of the dead, or even how many characters to have die in my story. And so when I wrote my first version, I really toned down the disaster as far as the number of people who died, and I didn't have anyone my character knew die. And then I showed it to some fourth graders outside of Houston, and they read it, and they liked a lot of the parts, but the first thing they said was, "You've got to kill more people."
Oh, really?
Yeah, they said, "You need to kill more people," and in fact, they were telling me which characters I needed to kill.
That's funny. Well, kids are kind of numb to death, I guess. It doesn't affect them as much.
Now, one thing they also did, there's a little kitten in the book which dies during the hurricane, and I did that deliberately because when I was researching the hurricane, I found out that a lot of animals on the island died. A lot of horses died. Lots and lots of cats and dogs.
Right.
Lots of children's pets died in the storm.
The unrecognized.
As did a lot of children themselves because they weren't strong swimmers. So I had this kitten die to be representative of all these children who had lost pets. And that's the thing that has bothered kids more than any of the people who died in the book. And many kids have called me and said, "I have this idea for how you can save mittens," and maybe they find mittens in this drawer. And so the kids are trying to save the little kitten more than some of the adult characters that I had die in the book.
Well, that's interesting. Now, as far as if this ever could happen again, now they built the wall, was it 1916?
Now, they started building the wall shortly after the hurricane. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers led the project and worked with the people of Galveston. They built it from 1902 to 1904. The original seawall was 3 miles long, and it's 17 feet high, so it's higher than the water got during the 1900 storm. And then they actually raised the island behind the seawall. They raised over 2,000 buildings, from small houses to a large cathedral. They raised them up and put dirt underneath. And so they've changed the physical layout of the island by doing so. Now, I can't say that it would not happen again. They did have another storm that was a similar intensity as the 1900 storm. In 1915, after the seawall was complete, another Category 4 storm came and hit Galveston about as directly as that 1900 storm did. Now the damage was much, much less, and only 275 people died, which is a lot by today's standards, but people at the time really felt like it would have been a repeat of the 1900 catastrophe were it not for the seawall there to protect them.
Yeah, to think about 275 people dying despite there being a 17-foot wall in front of there is pretty scary. I don't know.
You can imagine, and there are photographs of the waves that photographers took that day before the storm got really intense, and when you look at those pictures, it's wonderful they have the seawall there to protect them.
Well, do you have any more books on the horizon?
Well, I'm hoping to write a sequel to this one. Of course, it won't have a hurricane in it because I can't manufacture another hurricane so fast in time for my character to be there. But I am working on a mystery story, an adult mystery, so it's a very different genre for me to try, but that's my next project right now.
Well, you've had a lot of practice, and especially having to rewrite it almost twice.
I know. Yeah, I feel like I know how to write a book now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, a link can be found at Hurricane City down in the yellow box. It's a link called The Summer of the Storm. It's a 160-page book, and it's great reading, especially for children. This book can be found at Amazon.com. And is it in any bookstores?
They're carrying it in the Barnes & Nobles here in Texas. And I'm not sure, if they're going to extend it to Florida and other coastal cities. But I guess we'll see how it does here in Texas first.
Well, this is a great hurricane book. Thank you for being with us, Julie Lake.
Thank you so much, Jim. I enjoyed talking with you.